You sure you want that?
Ashtray?
Yeah, why not?
Ashtray.
Just swap it, yeah.
Ashtray.
Good.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The major Saturday night encounter. Tonight is called Freedoms, in the plural, of Speech. And we have here Christopher Hitchens, well known at this festival, celebrated at this festival, columnist, critic, polemicist, whose new book is not on sale, unfortunately, at the bookshop here, but I nonetheless thought I would speak of it because I've seen the proofs, and it's a life of Tom Paine, who I admire enormously, and of course it's very elegantly written. But interestingly, Christopher, it's dedicated to President Taliban of Iraq.
Yes, slightly cheeky on my part, but Thomas Paine was given the key of the Bastille when he went to France by the Marquis de Lafayette, who had led the storming of the Bastille, and asked to bring it back across the Atlantic to give to George Washington. And if you go to President Washington's home in Mount Vernon, you can see it hanging on the wall to this day. And Paine dedicated his Rights of Man to General Washington, who was then a fairly obscure provincial politician in the fringes of the English-speaking world. And I thought, if I could dedicate mine to the first and only ever elected president of Iraq, who had formed a people's army of his own to vindicate the rights of the oppressed and massacred Kurds, and who was a sworn foe of theocracy and fascism, I might, with the cost of, or the risk of impertinence, try and make something like the same point, and hope that his example is emulated.
And joining him in the debate is Shashi Tharoor, who was born in India but has lived a great deal of his life in...
Born here, in London.
Oh, in London, right. Oh,
I grew up in India.
You grew up in India. But since 1978, correct me if I get the facts wrong, has worked at the United Nations in New York. And since 1989, you've been at the United Nations in New York. And in 2002, you had a sequence of jobs with wonderfully elusive titles, all of which sounded enormously important. But in 2002, it was defined as Under-Secretary General for Communications and Public Information at the United Nations. But you were also a novelist, a short story writer, an essayist, whose latest book is called Bookless in Baghdad. And tomorrow, at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, you will be addressing the subject of terrorism, tolerance, and the global imagination. Is that your choice of...
Yes, more or less. It sort of emerges from, in fact, a lecture I delivered at the Berlin Festival some years ago when I thought about whether we were, in this globalized world, developing such a thing as a global human imagination. And I'll go into that in more detail tomorrow, but mixing it up with issues of terrorism and tolerance, which have become so much more relevant and important in recent years. And more problematic in recent years.
Right, freedoms of speech.
Could I just add something? I don't want this to seem too pally, but I know something about Shashi that he hasn't said, and that you haven't said either, which is that he was, for a brief time, the president of the Indian P.G. Wodehouse Society, and whatever else may come between us this evening, we will always have that bond, I hope.
Okay, Christopher, what I propose is that we should hear from each of them for a moment or two, but I've selected four. There are many, many issues of freedom of speech at the moment, and it seems to me appropriate that we should perhaps home in on one or two of them, because only by addressing the detail can you begin to deal with the generalities, and we can all spout lots of generalities about freedom, and it doesn't amount to very much. So that I therefore have proposed to them, and they know which ones they are, four particular issues. And we'll address those, and then later in the evening throw the discussion open for contributions from you and for questions. So freedoms in the plural, freedoms of speech, Christopher. Would you like to start?
Well, there's a category in America where I live of people who are known as First Amendment absolutists. I consider myself one of them. The First Amendment to the US Constitution says that Congress may make no law of any sort respecting the abridgment of freedom of the press or of expression or of free assembly. And those of us who say that that amendment means exactly what it says and nothing else, that it's written so to speak, no wiggle room exists, are known as the First Amendment absolutists. It only answers half the question that faces us, of course, because it usually isn't Congress or the state that tries to abridge free expression or free speech. Many a journalist hopes to be martyred one day by an attempt to censor him by the authorities. They live for this moment. There are even singers, like the Dixie Chicks, who think that they can claim martyrdom of this kind. Actually, in the present situation, the main threat to free expression comes from public opinion. So for a Democrat, someone who believes in popular sovereignty, it's a very great problem that public pressure, the pressure of the masses, if you like, is the one that you most likely have to face, and it's also much the hardest to resist, because you'll be accused of being an elitist. You can even be accused of being a racist if you simply say, no, I'm sorry, I reserve the right to criticize anything I like, and in particular, if you reserve the right, insist upon the right to criticize faith or religion. At that point, you may find yourself in some difficulty, and your editor will not tell you, I've been under pressure from the FBI to shut you up. He'll tell you, I've been under pressure from the community to do it.
But does that amendment
and to me, part of growing up is to say the community can go to hell, as far as that's concerned. I don't care about the community. I don't care about the crowd. I don't care about public opinion.
But that amendment must clash with the other, which is about freedom of religion, too.
No, it's the same amendment. The reason why the First Amendment is so important is that the Establishment Clause, as it's called, forbids the US government to take any side in a religious dispute or to allow any privilege for any faith or any faith-based group or any church. Is the same amendment that says there can be no abridgment of the freedom of expression. So it's as tightly written as any possible amendment could be. It's easy to look up. I recommend that you all do it. I was a founding member of Charter 88 in 1988 that said that an equivalent Bill of Rights should be promulgated for the United Kingdom in place of monarchy, tradition, heredity, and the famously unwritten rights that we have, rather like our invisible exports. I'd rather have things palpable myself, and upholdable, and inalienable, or unalienable, as President Bush used to put it. Clear on the point, but unclear on the concept.
Shashi, can I turn to you to address initially that particular concept, freedoms of speech?
Of speech. Well, I think that's probably where I'll start disagreeing with Christopher. I mean, I'm not an absolutist about that or anything else, largely because, though I believe passionately in freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and have chosen to exercise it in my writings, I think I do believe very much that this has to be upheld and protected. I tend, from where I sit, to see the case for responsibility as well, and that is for taking into account that freedom of speech has consequences that the speaker ought to bear in mind. And since Christopher came up with an American example, I think it's also worthwhile quoting the American Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said that freedom of speech does not extend to the right to shout fire falsely in a crowded theatre. In other words, when your freedom of speech causes other people harm, you do have to think twice about whether you can exercise it. And I suppose at some point the authorities have the responsibility to ensure that freedom is exercised reasonably. Now that's all very well in a democracy where we would like to think that the system is so constructed so that these judgments are made reasonably and fairly and not for ulterior motives. But when Christopher comes up with the question of the community, that's when we get into a different sort of problem, because there, it's, as he said, it's not so much about whether the state is trying to abridge your freedoms of speech. It's whether you say or write or paint or do other things which cause such grievous offense to a section of people in the society in which you live that the societal well-being is jeopardized. We were talking before coming in, I told you this anecdote, a true one, about 10 years ago from India, when a Bangalore newspaper in its Sunday magazine section published a short story called Muhammad the Idiot, which was about a retarded boy called Muhammad. And of course, the title was enough to inflame a mob of very, very angry people who stormed the newspaper, trashed the offices, broke up the press. And I have to tell you that very many fans of Indian democracy and freedom of speech didn't actually have much sympathy for the newspaper. It was they really ought to have known better, was the attitude. And indeed, the newspaper abjectly apologized the next day. And I believe the author of that headline has not worked in the paper since. So the problem here is, I'm afraid, one of what do you think in your society, in the social circumstances in which you're functioning, you can reasonably do without provoking a serious law and order problem.
So that case would be, when Christopher, you can come in a moment, the issue there is one of bad editing, because the art...
It may have been the author's original title, I have no idea.
No, but I mean, should it not have been noted by the editor, publisher, etc., at that point, that the very phrase itself, which was not intrinsic to the story, was going to be problematic?
Incendiary, yes. It should have been. You know, it's easy enough to say that if something provokes a mob to violence, it's the mob that ought to be punished or prosecuted for violating the law and being violent. But then you get into the whole question of whether a certain offence was so grievous as to serve as a sort of extenuation for the outrage expressed by the mob. We've seen this in the Satanic Verses debate too.
Christopher?
Fire. Fire.
Well, you know he's saying it falsely, don't you?
No, well, two points about that. One is,
the only fire is at the
how
tip
do
of
you
your
know
cigarette.
how you could be just as liable to start a panic if there was a fire by shouting fire as you could, in fact more likely than you would be liable to start a panic if there was not, as I think I've just demonstrated. Justice Holmes's famous judgment, it seems to me, is one of the stupidest remarks ever made from the bench of the United States Supreme Court. And by the way, he made it in the following context. A group of Yiddish-speaking socialists who were opposed to Mr. Wilson's First World War and America's participation in the imperial bloodbath gave out leaflets in Yiddish in New York saying, don't sign up for the war, don't believe in it, you're being led into a disaster. They were put in prison for life for producing leaflets in Yiddish, making a socialist case against the war. And the bloody fool Wendell Holmes had the nerve to say it was the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theatre where there was no fire. Of course there was fire. There was a bloodbath on the Western Front. That's a fire enough for anybody. So, you shouldn't have used such a bullshit example.
Oh, all right.
Right, okay.
So let me rephrase it. Your right to wave your fist stops just short of my face. How about that?
Well, the second thing is, as Mr. Lincoln once said, just as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. I don't claim the right not to be censored, I claim the right not to be a censor. I insist on this. The beliefs of the religious are very offensive to me. When I have to read in the newspapers that if I don't accept a bogus story about a supposed human sacrifice that took place in Jerusalem in something like AD 1933, if I don't accept this, I'm going to hell. If I don't accept this wonderful offer, I'm extremely offended. I think of all the cruelty and violence and misery and stupidity that's been inflicted by that. I do not go and burn down the nearest Baptist or Catholic church. I'd be ashamed of myself if I did. I don't call for people to form mobs to vindicate my hurt feelings. I don't do it. The Archangel Gabriel never said a word to the peasant Muhammad. Not a word. The event as described did not take place. I feel quite certain in saying so. Any more than the Archangel Gabriel announced himself to the non-Virgin Mary. I find it repellent to have to hear of people and the way they're treated who live under systems where that stuff is believed. It couldn't be more offensive to me. Who's ever going to say, well, if your feelings are hurt, Christopher, you're perfectly entitled to go burn down a newspaper or a house of worship? Right. How contemptible can you possibly get?
I want to take up this very point, which is the nature of offence, that something that gives offence is seen to legitimise violence. And the classic case that we're familiar with, all of us, is of the cartoons in the Danish newspaper, which appeared in the September, and only by the December of that year in Denmark had caused trouble across the world. 50 countries reproduced these cartoons, so that we all knew what we were talking about. But ambassadors were withdrawn from Copenhagen, and embassies around the world, Danish embassies, were attacked, and many people died because of cartoons. Can one just say, are a set of not very sophisticated cartoons worth a whole set of lives, Christopher?
Well, the principle certainly is, but here's what you have to understand. Picture, if you will, suppose you are a sensitive person, wishing to live in a multicultural universe. And you think, well, I'll go out of my way if I have to. I'll bend over backwards not to do anything that will needlessly inflame a Muslim person. Suppose that was your wish, your desire. How could you possibly have known, if you'd made that resolution, that some caricatures, actually, published in an afternoon paper in Copenhagen, would lead to an international pogrom against a small Northern European democracy, with its diplomatic immunity violated, its embassies burned, the embassies of a democracy burned, I mean to say, by mobs in the capital cities of dictatorships like Libya and Syria, where demonstrations are not normally allowed, where suddenly the police don't show up, where people who look Scandinavian are attacked, where anyone who is Scandinavian is condemned and subjected to a boycott, a racist boycott, in fact, from Pakistan to Indonesia, where violence and intimidation are used against the press, where embassies of supposedly Muslim countries call upon the Prime Minister of Denmark to tell him what he's not legally allowed to do, that he must censor his own press, which is not in his ability to do. And where threats, in other words, are brought by the heads of states who claim to speak for Islam. Now, I don't know any Muslim who thinks that the ambassador of Egypt or Libya or Algeria speaks for Islam. There's no reason to think that these ramshackle dictatorships have any such right. The Prime Minister of Denmark certainly has no right to intervene in what is published in the press in Denmark. It's one of the most extraordinary cases of intimidation, and this against a country that devotes a sizable part of its budget to helping the Palestinian Authority, to sending peacekeepers and humanitarian workers to the Arab world, that had done its best to accommodate Muslim immigrants, that doesn't have an imperial past, that didn't invade Vietnam or bomb Hiroshima or any of the usual crap that you hear. No, it means that if whatever you do, they will find a reason to take offense. And when they've done that, they think it's their axiomatic right to go straight to violence of the most criminal kind, including, you represent the United Nations here, Shashi, for heaven's sake, violations of diplomatic immunity, one of the most precious gains of human civilization. No, one has to oppose this 100%. It is intolerable, insufferable. It's enough concessions already that have been made. Has to stop now.
Now, Shashi, you cited the example of the story Mohammed the Idiot as requiring a nuanced interception by editors, publishers and so on, because it was clear that that was going to offend, and trouble could be avoided by shrewd, perhaps cowardly even, Christopher might say, editing. Does that apply to cartoons, caricatures in the Danish press? Do you think the burden was on the editor not to publish?
Absolutely. Well, but before I say that, let me say that I actually agree with the latter part of Christopher's observations, that nothing can justify or condone the behavior, the violations of diplomatic immunity, indeed, the colossal destruction to people and property that followed. But there is very little doubt in my mind that the entire exercise was designed to inflame. The editors actually sought caricatures of Muhammad. They wrote to the Danish Cartoonists Association. A majority of the cartoonists turned down their invitation to do caricatures of Muhammad. And one of the 12 who responded did so by drawing a cartoon, not of Muhammad the Prophet, but of a named schoolboy in a Danish school called Muhammad, who wrote on a blackboard, this is the caricature, wrote on a blackboard, the editors of this paper are reactionary provocateurs. That was one of the 12 cartoons actually said that. And when they published it, the editors added their own notes to this cartoon, saying this cartoonist is a coward who does not understand the menace posed to our society by Muslim fundamentalism. Was that effect on the cartoon? So, in other words, they knew perfectly well what they were doing. Now, as I said, that doesn't excuse the misbehavior of those who attacked people and property and all of that. But it does say that when you know you're going to create offense, you have to ask yourself why you're doing this. Perhaps you couldn't have predicted every single detail of the consequences, but that there would be consequences, I think there could have been no doubt about. I mean, Christopher and I are both friends of Salman Rushdie, and we certainly know that, that what he went through, no one should have to go through, and of course, one of his translators was killed and all of that. But the fact that Muslims took as much offense as they did to the depictions of a fictionalized version of the Prophet in this novel, a novel which in many other ways, and perhaps not to Christopher's taste, is actually an amazing affirmation of mystical belief towards the end of the novel. if such a novel could cause that kind of offense and lead to the consequences it did, it's extremely difficult to believe the editors of this newspaper didn't have an inkling of what they were stirring up. And this is a newspaper, by the way, which had a record in the 1930s of publishing anti-Semitic articles. I mean, they have most of their circulation over the years.
Right to publish anti-Semitic articles and publish anti-Christian cartoons. What was said about the Danish cartoons is exactly what was said about Salman when he published the novel. You must remember. People said, aha, darkly, they'd say, he knew what he was doing. Hugh Trevor Roper said he should be beaten up and kicked around in the street by Pakistani gangs because he hoped to bring on a response. Well, of course he wrote a novel using Holy Writ for literary purposes, knowing that that might upset some people. He thought it was about time to open this discussion in the Muslim world, and many Muslim intellectuals sided with him. But straight away, the immediate resort to violence and intimidation, not just the threat of murder, but murder itself. It doesn't matter to me if these people believe this, if they say, for example, we don't represent our prophet in figure, or indeed almost the human figure itself in figure, because we fear idolatry. That's good. It's much better than having pictures of weeping virgins or statues of them that may be led to weep if you can put enough pig's blood on it and put a candle nearby. The endless fraudulence of Christianity. Fine. That's their belief. But they can't tell me I can't talk about the Prophet Muhammad. They absolutely cannot do that.
But this is where I go back to your earlier comment about you're choosing not to be offended by other people's religious beliefs when you don't have any. I mean, part of the problem, I think, in our world is our failure sometimes to realize that other people aren't necessarily like us. In other words, that there are societies in different stages of cultural consciousness or sophistication. Not everyone is a Christopher Hitchens. And if there are people in sufficient number who are literalist in their beliefs and therefore will feel grievously wounded, I mean, if for them an offense to the Virgin Mary, or more likely an offense to Prophet Muhammad, is equivalent to a sexual assault on their mother or their sister or their wife or whatever, and they react accordingly, I'm afraid to some degree they are to be pitied, because that's a level of reaction that you would not be capable of. But since they do react that way, should we not, as people producing that which is going to cause this reaction, be conscious that it might?
Right,
I mean, on the satanic verses, I remember at the time an argument with an Indian Muslim who was a government official, but not at that point involved in any of the decisions on the book, so he was speaking not for the government, but in a social conversation, who, when I said, this is outrageous, and how can you ban this book? The people who are clamoring for it to be banned haven't read it. And he said, that's beside the point. It doesn't matter that they haven't read it. It's enough that enough of their leaders are saying that this is what the book does, that it creates a law and order problem, and the duty of the government is to ensure that it maintains law and order in these communities. And that was the argument that he was making, and it's one which I, on that particular instance, found very difficult to accept. But I can see how in certain circumstances a government or an editor or somebody else in a position of decision-making will have to weigh in the balance the right to publish a particular cartoon, to publish a particular short story or a novel, versus the potential loss of life and destruction of property to large numbers of people. Now, there is no one rule for around the world. Well, so you might say that you can't publish this in this country, but you can in that one, because in that country people will not be offended.
You can't say that anymore.
But then, my dear Shashi, you should be very happy because everyone is weighing it. There wasn't a single newspaper in Britain that published those cartoons. There wasn't a single one, there was one magazine in America either. I know the people in charge of these matters in many cases. I went on CNN to debate some spokesman for a Muslim organization, and CNN put up the cartoons, the page of Denmark, pixelated. And I said to the interviewer, you're not doing this because you're afraid of upsetting my Muslim fellow guest, are you? You're doing it because you're afraid that you'll be burned out if you do, your bureaus. She said, yes, that's right.
Is that not a legitimate fear?
It's a very legitimate fear if you allow the right of Muslims to use violence against anything they don't like. Of course it's a legitimate fear. It's certainly, if it's not legitimate, it's a real one. But it seems to me amazing that my profession should give up without a fight on this point. So you should be happy, and they're all doing it. PBS, the public station, decided they could do it this way, and it's significant. They said, we can show the cartoons in this manner. We can show them the imams of Denmark traveling around showing the cartoons to others. We can film them doing that, and by accident, the cartoons are in the picture. Now, what does that mean? These imams have the right to show this blasphemy to anyone, and did, and they added 3 cartoons of their own, one of which showed the Prophet as a pig, which, as you know, is an incitement in itself. The words in the paper. They can do it, and we can't even see what they're talking about. Do you understand the significance of this? The media is much too dominated, for my taste, by images. Everything is image now. Even the New York Times is mainly pictures. Here, the whole story is about an image, and no one is allowed to make up their minds by seeing it themselves. We're shielded from it by our editors in a free press and a free country who are paralyzed with fear and paralyzed with the idea that anyone might be hurt.
All right,
this is disgraceful.
Let's take on a case where they did take an action. Earlier this year, David Irving was sent to prison for 3 years for being in Austria and being accused of being he confessed to being a Holocaust denier. I'm sorry.
No, he denied being
He denied being a Holocaust denier, having brought a libel case 6 years earlier against an American professor who said he was, but having 16 years previous to that denied that there were gas chambers at Auschwitz. This is a very eccentric, bizarre, self-obsessed historian who claimed the right to say what he believed, regardless of the amount of offence it was given, and he was denied that freedom to offend. 3 years in jail, is that right, Christopher? Do you think that's fair?
They're appealing to make it 10.
Yeah. So, good?
3 years from now.
Is that good?
It's a scandal. It's a scandal in itself. And as it happens by its timing, because it almost the same week as the Danish controversy, it allowed Muslim demagogues to say, you see, the West doesn't really believe in free speech.
That's right.
And I would take that as a criticism of Western governments, not of myself, because I defend Irving too, and for several years have been doing so. Not just for his right to do this as a matter of free speech, but actually as a matter of free inquiry. I'll say it now and I'll take my chances, but I've read all of David Irving's books on the Third Reich, and I don't think anyone who hasn't read them is educated in the argument. Even at that trial in London with Deborah Lipstadt, who's the woman you mean, John Keegan, many other eminent historians came into court and said what I've said repeatedly in print. He is a very major contributor to the subject. He's the man who showed the Goebbels diaries, the Hitler diaries were a fraud and the Goebbels diaries were genuine, when Hugh Trevor Roper, our doyen of historians, fell for it the wrong way. I think he has the right to advance his claims, as well as the right to express his own opinions.
It is very interesting that, of course, it's only in Austria which has this law.
Well, they're overcompensating in Austria.
Indeed, they are super guilty, so they have the law that to deny the Holocaust
You know the joke about Austria? What were its two historic achievements? To have convinced the world that Beethoven, Hitler was German and Beethoven was Viennese.
And that Kurt Waldheim was an international.
Yeah, he's an international citizen.
But no, in fact, on this one I don't.
But the issue of globalisation blows. I mean, that is completely ludicrous, is it not?
I agree completely with you and Christopher on that. However, it's interesting that shortly after that, there's been this whole debate in Canada about a law that would have criminalised denial of the so-called Armenian genocide. You know, and the Turks made a huge fuss about this, saying that there was no genocide and you can't criminalise its denial. And this went back and forth, and I gather the law has now been withdrawn from consideration. But the question is, how many things can you criminalize imagining or arguing or inquiring into? You know, it starts off with one and goes on to the other. Again, deep offense is caused by arguing that there was no Holocaust. And I think if you stand up and argue there wasn't one, you will suffer generally before the tribunal of public opinion. But to be thrown into jail for it is certainly a bit difficult to swallow.
But this court of public opinion is getting more and more aggressive in that people on every hand are now alleging that they have been offended and something must be done, we are offended. Now this is a recent case, the third example, only happened this week, when Asia House, which was putting on an exhibition of M.F. Hussein's paintings of Hindu goddesses, closed down the exhibition in response to a protest from the Hindu Human Rights Organization, who said that their goddesses were being depicted obscenely. Now, they did that, and nobody's made any fuss about that. You tell me he's a very distinguished painter.
Oh, he's India's Picasso. It's an outrageous thing that this was done. I heard about it from you. I hadn't heard about it previously. But there was a similar episode in Gujarat when an exhibition of his was trashed by a mob. I mean, there are two fundamental things to be said about this. First, that Hussain has been using Hindu goddesses in his paintings for years. He's 92 years old, and he's been painting since he was 12. So this is not exactly somebody who's trying to cash in on sensationalism. And he uses Hindu iconography very much neither for religious purposes nor for sacrilegious purposes. He sees this essentially as a cultural construct. For him, as an Indian Muslim painter, he derives, as it were, sustenance from the cultural traditions of India. And he sees, therefore, an image of a goddess as something that he can use in his art, just as when he did paintings about Kerala in a book that I co-authored with him, he used an elephant as a symbol of Kerala. In many ways, he sees a goddess. I remember him doing some paintings that many of us criticized at the time, praising Indira Gandhi by depicting her as the goddess Durga. So he's somebody who's used these metaphors before, and no one has objected. But now we are living in a climate where intolerance is allowed to prevail. And if I might say so, it's particularly obnoxious to me as a believing Hindu that Hindus should do this, because Hinduism is the one faith of which I know in which there is no such thing as a Hindu heresy. You're free to believe pretty much anything and be a Hindu, and disbelieve anything and still be a Hindu, which is what makes it such an attractive religion.
Hindu art depicts goddesses in the most extraordinary ways.
Well, actually, I have to say, any religion involves being able to believe in anything.
and to take offence.
Yes, look, it used to be, before the Enlightenment really crested, that it was left to communities to do this. In other words, the Jewish community in Amsterdam is the one that sentenced Baruch Spinoza to death. Not the Christians for his heresy. They thought, we leave it to the Jews to punish their own heretics. They did agree, they praised. They praised the Amsterdam synagogue for uttering the great curse on Spinoza and expelling and excommunicating the most talented Jew in the Netherlands of the time. But are we really wanting to go back to that, where every community is its own tyranny, everyone's ghettoized? If you're Hindu, you can condemn another? No, I really think we have to have a Bill of Rights that applies to everybody, and to which any citizen of any stripe or religion can appeal if they've been oppressed by the wider community or by their own.
This particular example of the paintings, though, the painter is condemned by the Hindu community basically because he's a Muslim who dared to do such depictions rather than a Hindu.
Right.
So
I'm sure
well, as we know with the cartoons, only Muslims are allowed to represent the Prophet Muhammad as a pig. Come on, this is not serious. I'm not going to live under the dictatorship of people like this. I'm not going to listen to their opinions. I'm not going to respect them. I'm going to say, no, you keep it to yourself. Do not dare address me. Do not dare talk to me as if you're warning me when I comment on this. I won't have it. I won't be talked to in that tone of voice.
Christopher, you're quite right about this. This is clearly a shared view, I would say, by people in this room. Now, one can say one must not yield. One must defend the right to offend others. One must not close down theatres. One must not close down exhibitions. But the fact is, under pressure of the mob, from all sorts of different directions, it is actually playing into the political agenda, which is now on the public stage. So we can inveigh against it. We can deplore it. What do we want done? And what can be effective in this situation?
Well, we used to have a blasphemy law that only protected the Christian religion. And you'll remember, what it was in the late 70s, Mary Whitehouse brought a prosecution of the poet James Kirkup, who'd written a sort of homoerotic poem by the crucifixion. And I don't think in the end the prosecution was carried, as it were. But
she carried the day, but it was not condemned.
It wasn't condemned.
The judge...
But it was, for many people, the first time it was discovered that there was A, a blasphemy law, and B, that it only protected one religion. Now, when the Stanek versus controversy emerged, there were those who said there should be a blasphemy law and it should protect all religions. I said, no, there should be no blasphemy law. Because, as Karl Marx so brilliantly put it, the criticism of religion is the beginning of all criticism. If you don't have the right to criticize religion, you have no right at all. It is the most important argument that we have, ever since the dawn of civilization. Philosophy begins where religion ends. Not to be able to discuss religion without fear, without inhibition, means you don't have the right to speak on anything important at all. Of course, no blasphemy law. And Tony Blair's capitulation to this and saying, well, if it's sauce for the goose, it's sauce for the gander, seems to me the most abysmal surrender that one could possibly have on the main point of free expression.
But to take up the point you make about the Jews and Spinoza, I mean, religious communities used to police their own, and in a sense that kept everyone happy because it wasn't their particular game. But it's not possible now. What we have is such a multi-faith community that different segments of the community are imposing their own standards on each other by means of fear. I mean, there was the famous case recently, that you will know, of a play by a Sikh player, young woman attacking the elders of the Sikh community in which she lived, and the Sikh young men went and attacked the theatre, breaking windows and so on, and the theatre closed the play.
Well, it's a matter for the police.
Well, indeed it was, but the point is that the theatre didn't see it like that, and the theatre acted quickly to close down the play because of the fear of violence. We're confronted with it, Christopher, and the police are not called.
It's a huge encouragement to those who want to resort to the use of force in civil society. I mean, what could possibly be simpler? There's another question. Well, it's the same question in a way. My hero, Thomas Paine, was very much attacked and criticized by the vile Dr. Samuel Johnson, one of the most ranked Tories there's ever been. But I have to say I have a soft spot for the old buzzard all the same. But if only for his lexicography. And when he produced his first dictionary, he was visited by a group of old ladies, Respectable Women's Association, who called upon him in Fleet Street and said, Dr. Johnson, we'd like to congratulate you on your refusal to put any indecent words in your dictionary. And he said, ladies, I'm very obliged to you for revealing to me that you've been looking for them. That simple story is actually all you need about the censorship mentality. Those who want to be offended will always find something. There's no way of forestalling that. And just as one cannot tolerate being censored oneself, one can say with absolute confidence that if one was in favor of censorship, in principle, platonically, say, we wish it could be done, decency could be protected, obscenity could be avoided, offense could be... Who's going to get the job? Do you know anyone? There will never be a human being born who's good enough for that job. No man is good enough to be another man's master in that way. There cannot be a censor or censorship that does not degenerate into absurdity and corruption, and there never has been, and there never will be, and all the excuses for it that there could be, that it protects superstition and religious fanaticism would be the worst.
Do you agree?
Oh, I agree. I'm certainly against censorship of any sort, certainly official censorship. What I'm talking about is self-restraint and responsibility on the parts of those who are conducting certain actions. Policing by the community doesn't actually solve it. I mean, you might well find, for example, there could well be Muslim conservatives who want to buy peace with Hindu extremists by condemning their own M.F. Hussain, as it were. In any case, M.F. Hussain wouldn't want to be principally thought of as a Muslim anyway. He is a Muslim, but he would rather be thought of, first of all, as a painter. His religion is incidental to his art. And I think
They'll never
there's
get
no...
that point.
Yeah,
They'll never get that point.
But that's precisely where I'm not supporting any idea of self-policing by communities. But I do think that the law and order argument can't entirely be overlooked. Christopher's right that you do have to ensure that people who break the law are prosecuted, so that a fellow who goes in and vandalizes a theatre ought to be proceeded against, and I hope in this particular example you've given that these people have been, they have not been, actually, well, they should have been. But the fact still is the theatre, in turn, will ask themselves whether it's worth it. There's no satisfaction, you know, in being run over if you know that the driver who's run you over is going to go to jail. It's not going to do you very much good after you've been run
Police
over.
in Manchester last week found the energy to arrest and charge someone who stood outside the Catholic Evidence Guild office there, holding up a copy of my book on Mother Teresa. They were very swift to punish him. You can't do that. Who knows what will happen if we let you do it. But those who actually use and threaten violence are let go. Get used to it, or don't get used to it. Get used to it and you'll live under it. Resist it now while it can still be opposed. Because there's a police state coming that says that we are there to protect religion and all religions. And it'll all be done in the name of niceness. It'll all be benign. Can you bear it?
The story of the Sikh play is even more confounding because the theatre management had wanted to commission a play from a major ethnic community within the city and had opened the doors to consultation with them, invited them in, invited them to rehearsals, invited them to contribute, all by way of being the generous, liberal, enlightened theatre world, and it had spiked their attempts. So concessions don't win the day, perhaps.
They do not. Joseph Priestley, and he'll give you an example. Joseph Priestley, the man who discovered oxygen, had his laboratory in Birmingham, and while he was doing his great scientific experiments, he also announced that he didn't believe in divine revelation at all. He didn't believe in the monarchy, that he was effectively Unitarian, and as you know, the Unitarian belief is that there's one God maximum, one God at most, if that. And a mob formed. It was called the Church and King mob. It did a lot of work in those days for the Hanoverian usurpers and their friends. And they smashed up his laboratory. They destroyed the only real scientific laboratory in Britain. They were so appalled that there was this scientist going on and making these profane remarks. He had to move to Philadelphia. Well, good for them. They got what they wanted.
And Philadelphia got it.
Philadelphia got Joseph Priestley. Yeah. Good for them.
Christopher
They had
believes...
every right to have their feelings hurt by something they didn't understand, hadn't read, didn't care about, and knew that they wouldn't be punished by the authorities for acts of vandalism and cruelty and intimidation. We want this back now. I thought we got over this. Now I have to face it all again. Arguments I'd forgotten having to have, I'm having to have again with religious fascists. I'm ready to do it till I draw my last breath, but I'm appalled at anyone making excuses for them.
Well, we live in... you believe that there's a police state coming to defend religions of all kinds.
Friendly police state.
Friendly police state, kind, benign. How is that going to play out? I mean, how is that going to play out in different communities? Are they all going to become theocracies, in which you cannot speak against the prevailing faith of the day, or indeed any other faith within multi-racial communities?
I suppose we'd all really enjoy living in a planet full of Christopher Hitchenses, but the fact is we don't. And so all I'm saying is that we do need to take into account the fact that some things we say and do will have consequences. Now, which is not to say...
Taking into account, does that mean conceding or just saying, well, I'm taking it into account, but I'm still going to do it?
Well, there are perhaps ways of doing things differently. That short story could have been given a different title. The question of the play, again, I haven't read or seen the play, so I don't know anything about it. I gather that one outraged Sikh leader said, we would have supported this play, but why did she have to set it in a temple? In other words, I believe it involves an act of either incest or rape that takes place in a temple, and that they found offensive. Now, I'm not suggesting that the playwright's artistic integrity ought to be compromised on the altar of somebody else's intolerance, but I am saying that she, in writing it, and the theatre in putting it up, ought perhaps to have borne in mind that maybe there was some effective diplomacy to be conducted before they actually went ahead with this, for fear precisely what happened.
But they had been conducting all these acts of diplomacy before, as the play progressed, in order to nuance the relationship with the community which they cherished and which they wanted to see thrive. And it backfired because the word was out. Oh, they're doing this play. Oh, the word is out. They're telling us about it. Let's go and protest.
Well, the Regent's Park Mosque came to Salman at one point after the hideous threat of murder, suborning of murder for money offered by a theocratic leader of a foreign state. Just roll it round your tongue a bit. The theocratic leader of a foreign state, in his own name, offers money for murder of someone for writing a novel. Pretty frontal attack on free expression. Everyone says, oh, well, let's see if we can't negotiate this. An offer comes from the Regent's Park Mosque. Well, if you, Mr. Rushdie, will cease being an apostate, declare your adherence to Islam again, maybe we'll stop trying to kill you. And he actually did it.
And
they lied to him. They fucking flat out lied to him. These people have no concept of truth, no concept of honesty at all. The idea of tolerance and pluralism to them. Ask them, you want to do this in Birmingham or in London or Manchester, wherever it might be, Walsall. When can we hope for a synagogue to be opened in Saudi Arabia? When can we hope for a Christian church to be opened in Saudi Arabia? Or even a Shia one, as a matter of fact, which they consider to be a vicious heresy. When are you going to condemn the blowing up of mosques in Iraq? I'm an atheist. I wouldn't put a bomb in the Samara Dome. I have a natural human resistance to profanity. It comes from Antigone. It comes from Sophocles. It doesn't come from monotheism. They applaud these acts of atrocity and blasphemy. They have no concept of a reciprocal relationship on this. They say, you concede to us, and we will concede nothing to you, and you should be proud to have us in your midst. Insufferable. Insufferable.
Where do you believe that the resistance to this trend can be seeded and developed? And you want the law of blasphemy abolished. I agree with you. I think it should be abolished. But where do you see the powers of resistance to this worldwide trend coming from?
I see one capitulation after another at present.
You're that gloomy?
Yeah. I mean, if countries like Holland and Denmark, the most tolerant, broad-minded, open, multicultural, all this, have their filmmakers and intellectuals and journalists targeted for murder and their embassies violated, security violated in dictatorship countries by mobs stirred up by policemen. I think that should give people a warning. I mean, there are a lot of fools, there may even be some here, who say, well, the United States deserved it because it's a big country and very arrogant and very proud and imperialist and so on. Yeah, well, how do you feel about the treatment of the Dutch and the Danes? No, you have to realize, which people are very slow to do, what the nature of the enemy is.
Are you as depressed?
And not give any inch to him. No excuses. Don't want to hear intellectuals in my country make excuses for this. That would be a start.
Are you as depressed?
No, I'm not depressed. I mean, I actually take Christopher's point that some of this is inexcusable, and I don't think in any case that I would want to make any excuses for their behavior. But what I would want us to do is to live with the world as we have it. Recognize that we can't tell other people what to believe. We are ultimately responsible for our own beliefs. We are responsible for what offends us. We cannot tell somebody not to be offended by something we've done if they choose to be offended. And this is ultimately a question of whether we can coexist in a world with different scales of belief, different intensities of conviction, different degrees of disbelief or unbelief in the case of some, and at the same time manage to get along. I mean, I'm afraid that certainly from where I sit in the United Nations, we are actively trying to promote what we call a dialogue among civilizations, which is all about trying to focus on the things we respect in each other, in other cultures, and minimize the areas of friction and disagreement. This, unfortunately, is one of the, religion and the question of blasphemy and so on, goes to the heart of what is the most difficult thing in relations amongst different nations, different societies, different cultures. But there are a lot of other things that we can talk to each other about and engage with each other over. And therefore, because of that, I'm not depressed. I think there will be changes.
Shashi,
there will be evolution in people's attitudes.
You're talking about something much softer, I think. You're talking about an interfaith dialogue, as you talked about a multi-religious community. What about the most important minority in the history of the world? Those who have never believed in God, those who believe that an ethical life is possible without religion, those who have studied the stuff and know that Judaism is derived from ancient race myths, and that Christianity is a plagiarism of that, and Islam an even worse plagiarism of the two above, who don't want it. There are lots of us. Actually, the largest branch of the humanist movement in the world is probably in India, which has a wonderful secular tradition. We have to be insulted and outraged every day by what we see and what we read, by slaughter and murder. Slaughter and murder and barbarism and insult and superstitious nonsense. We do not reply in kind. We don't say, we'll go and kill you if you go on insulting us like this. Do we get no credit for saying this? When has anyone ever said, what's it like to be insulted, as someone who thinks that civilization is a real thing? Why is it always interfaith? Why is it always interdenominational? Why can't we say that all of these cults are equal and equivalent glimpses of the untrue.
But what... I'm going to invite you to join this discussion in a moment, but just let me put this to you. You speak of the UN and these attempts to deal with this increasing mob willingness to take offence and use violence. But you are like talking to like in the United Nations. You're civilised, affable, tolerant wings of all the different faiths and of no faith.
More glimpses of the untrue, Christopher.
I'm afraid.
This is the UN, Christopher.
Yes, ask the people of Darfur about that.
Well, exactly the
They
point
played
I'm
it the
making.
Kofi Annan way in Darfur, and now there's almost no one left to kill.
But the point
This is
I'd
I'm...
another
rather have been
conversation.
unilateral myself.
I'm talking
Hate
about...
to say it. Even preemptive would have been better than watching the mass slaughter by Arab Muslims of African
is
Muslims.
there
Our
a-
African brothers and sisters are being killed as we speak in thousands every day of the year.
Is there-
And we
is-
decided to play at the Kofi Annan
Is there
way.
a unilateral
It'll
option?
be over soon.
Is there a single country on earth that's prepared to go to war over these people in Darfur? The solutions
If
that are
anyone
being
proposed
found...
it, you know what would be said.
Well, I'm
No,
just telling you.
no, we're not
You-
going into... Let
we
me
shouldn't
just...
get into
I
that,
want
but
to
that's-
make
Well, I don't
a
know,
point.
I'm beginning to feel...
Christopher, I'm asking...
punchy
making the
about it.
point. I'm making your point for you, Christopher.
Oh,
that
darling.
that the UN are having conversations and being very civilized together, but they are not effective in arenas where people are killing and murdering because they are living in a different world. There is no association between the debates within the UN and what goes on in the killing fields. Is that not the point you were making, I would think? I mean, how can you be effective?
Well, in fact, I think we have been effective. I mean, there's a slew of Nobel Peace Prizes on the walls of the United Nations to point to various effective cases.
Teresa and Henry Kissinger.
That's right. Well, we're not resting on our laurels or theirs.
Two merchants of death and superstition.
It's so difficult to argue with Christopher because I enjoy him so much. But the fact is...
You see why he's a diplomat and I'm not.
Right, let's have the lights up and you can all join in this. Do we have microphones here too? Can we, yes? Yes, the microphone's there. Can we have some lights and I can see who we can go to?
There's a hand up there.
There's a hand up there. Oh, right, yes, let's go there, please. And oh, that's getting better. Yes?
I'm a monarchist and a mystic, but I applaud you, Christopher.
Right.
It's jolly decent of you.
Hello, I wish we could stay longer and carry on this debate. I think
Why can't we?
my greatest worry in the world today, and I'm totally with you, Christopher, even though I may have a faith, is that the freedom of speech is the most crucial thing open to us as individuals to become mutually, cooperatively, kindly living together. If I disagree with you, it's fine, isn't it? It can't be harmful, what I think. What I do is, and I believe, basically, it has to be that my belief system is of no harm to anyone else. It's what I do that's harmful. The reason is, when I hear a debate like this, it's as if Christopher is the one who's wrong because he has the courage to be very, very direct in what he says. And I find in my life, when I speak passionately about anything, people accuse me of being aggressive. I'm not aggressive. I care. And I think speech and freedom of speech has got to be put on the agenda much more. We are losing it. We are losing it day by day.
Thank you. Someone over there?
While the mic's travelling, could I just make one point? I mean, I think it's important, and I should have said this to Christopher too. It's not about your belief system or Christopher's or anybody else's. It's about the way you choose to express your belief system in relation to someone else. That creates, it's when you have a conversation with someone, you can make a point, you can make your point to them in one way, and you can make the same point to them with four-letter words or expletives or whatever, right? And you would not do the latter because you know it would make it difficult for you to talk to the other person because the other person would react not to the substance of your beliefs, but to your four-letter words. That's normal human social interaction. In a sad way, what's happening with this debate in terms of Islam is that a lot of what is being said or written is interpreted by many Muslims, not all, but by many, as the equivalent of four-letter words directed at them. And so one could make a different point about the rationality or otherwise of your beliefs and theirs, without doing so in a way, as these caricatures did, that was seen by them as direct insults. That's the difference.
Well,
Okay,
yes, he has. Yeah. Yes, he has. Yeah, yeah, I know. But look, I wouldn't.
Speech what you've just done to me. Because I don't know.
Yes, give her the microphone.
Can't bloody hear.
we'll
Can't
take
four-letter hear.
There's somebody over there. Has they got a microphone over there? At the back there? Yes? Okay.
Seems to be that a lot of this comes down to a subjective judgment. How offended do I have to be to get rights?
Sorry?
The right to be offended. How offended do I have to be to get these rights? To make a fuss?
You should probably cloak it in faith. There's a privilege for that. If someone said, I don't like what you just said, I'm going to kill you, I think the police might be on your side. If they said, I don't like what you said, I'm going to kill you because it was my faith, you can't count on the cops or the government anymore to do their job. And to the lady in the front, I do not say my belief system is no threat to anyone else's. I would hate to say that. I think my belief system is definitely a threat to those who believe in God and wish to impose theocracy. If it wasn't, I would be ashamed to have it. But we can, if you want to make it gentle, we can. We have a great tradition in this country. It goes back, well, a long way, but the classic statements of which are in John Milton's Areopagitica and in John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty, where it is said that however discredited an opinion may be, to ban it would still be a huge mistake, because otherwise there would be no way of finding out if you yourself had made a correct point, if you had no opponent, if you'd silenced them. There would be nothing to argue with. There would be no measure of your own articulacy or your own willingness to argue. Thus, it must always be the case that any opinion, no matter how unpopular, must be at the front and center of the argument. Rosa Luxemburg put it even better, actually. She said freedom of speech is meaningless unless it's for the person who thinks differently.
Do you believe in the laws of libel, slander?
No. I left England partly because of the laws of libel. It makes journalism almost impossible because, again, it's a matter of hurt feelings. A person who's bringing a lawsuit in Britain, many of them tried it on me when I was here, some of them have tried it since I've left, has only to prove that their reputation has been damaged or their feelings hurt. They don't have to prove that what I say is not true. They have it again. That's a secular form of the blasphemy law.
Right, there was someone down here who's got a microphone already, and there's somebody...
Thank you.
Yeah, let's hear. We'll just have a few questions and then we'll do a black...
I'm going to defer to Christopher on my American history, but I seem to remember in freedom of speech there's something about inciting violence. And I'm kind of curious as to why no one's mentioned George Galloway saying that Tony Blair should be the subject of suicide bombers. Is it just too absurd? Or otherwise unworthy?
Okay, we'll...
Sorry, to exhale more rapidly than I wanted to. I'll remember the question then.
Galloway and Tony Blair. I have a question over here. Have we got a microphone? Where's the microphone? Nobody can speak until there's a microphone. Has someone a microphone? Yes. Then speak, please.
Okay. I'm an atheist, and like Christopher, I'm also offended on a daily basis by the idea that because I don't believe in some kind of revealed truth, it's not possible for me to lead a moral and a decent and an ethical life. I find that very offensive. But listening to the debate, I'm starting to think that maybe the problem is that us atheists are just too nice, and we suffer our offence in silence. So perhaps we should get a bit more nasty.
And take offence.
No, I know how you feel. I'm always being told I'm too nice.
Bring the microphone here. Someone over here?
It's a dreadful accusation, isn't it?
There's someone in the middle who's the middle people here aren't getting a bite of the chair. Wait a minute, we must have a microphone. Microphone. Cross. Thank you. And then there's... Yes.
Yeah, this is an interesting debate, and Christopher Hitchens has, you live up to your reputation being a formidable debater. But I suspect that I'm Indian, and I rather sympathize with the view that Mr. Tharoor takes, because, the specifics of the position that he's taking in this debate are very, very peculiar to what we see in India. 150 million Muslims, 80 million Christians, 800 million Hindus, and some of them have views that are even more right to what Adolf Hitler had about the views and there are about 50, 60 million of them, quite a substantial number. So, we did have laws in our country for how exactly you depict religious minorities, largely because there is no saying how remarks could be taken within or outside, out with the context of how they are expressed. So I may have the right to free speech because, I'm an educated man and live in international life, and, I can sit at the Hay Festival and listen to you. But if I say something that is deemed to be offensive by someone who doesn't have the same privileges as me, because we are a country of, vast variations in income and education and upbringing and culture, it can result in disruption to civil society. And isn't this one of the fundamental duties of citizenship, that apart from, the right to express ourselves, we also have the duty to be conscious of our place in society and what we do to people who don't have the same privileges as we do. So maybe we are talking about cultural context. In Western Europe, we have the right and the privilege to make these remarks, and they won't be taken out of context. And we're outraged when they are by people who don't have the same privileges as us. But, this is an Indian situation which I thought I'd bring to you.
Right.
Yes.
Now, you will take on that question and the
No,
Galloway
I
question.
prefer that question
Yes.
above all
Yes.
others. I mean,
Yes.
because one of the things, that's how I know Shashi, I'm a great lover of India and its secular constitution and its multi-ethnic and multi-cultural life. I mean, it was true 2 years ago, I think you could say in India that the president of India was a Muslim.
Still is.
Still. The head of the Indian nuclear program was a Muslim. The editor of the Times of India was a Muslim. The head of the Indian cricket team was a Muslim. I forget how it goes.
No longer, but
and there
yes.
are more Muslims in India than there are in Pakistan. And everyone remembers what last happened when there was a struggle over whether you were a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian. And one of the most evil things about the Al-Qaeda organization is that it hopes to destroy the attachment of India to Pakistan, of Kashmir to India, and annex it to Pakistan, which, if it was successful, would lead to a bloodbath that would make 1947-48 seem absolutely negligible. So it's a matter really of etiquette. I don't go around in Washington, where I live, standing outside a synagogue and saying, "You filthy Jew." I have the right to do it, but I don't. Let alone outside a mosque or outside a Catholic church. I wouldn't dream of doing such a thing. The question is, how much does this etiquette depend upon us? For example, there's a famous six-letter word, actually, that used to be used about African Americans in the United States that nobody uses anymore. There's no law that says you can't. No serious person would use it, and no serious person would listen to it being said and not protest. That was done without legislation. There's no one, it's not illegal to do it. It's a cultural achievement, civilizational achievement. What I'm being asked to do, though, sir, you understand the distinction I'm going to make. What I'm being asked to do in, I'll call it my own country just for now, my country of birth, my country of adoption, is legally to be told I may not criticize someone else's religious belief. Now, that's quite different.
Yeah, but I didn't...
If you don't see that difference, and I think you do, then I've been making my points very clumsily. But I hope I've made it in a more polished way this time.
Christopher, may I chip in? Because I don't think anyone, this is a straw man, this business about legislation making things impossible, because I'm not in favor of a blasphemy law any more than you are. But you've just made the point that I was making, which is that ultimately this is a question of cultural evolution, and that different cultures in different parts of the world have evolved differently, and your absolutist position doesn't take sufficiently into account the fact that other societies and cultures are not at the place that you would have them be. That's precisely my argument. You've just made my point.
I think the situation is much better in India than it is here. No one is forbidden to criticize someone else's religion, but everybody knows they have a civic and social responsibility. And there is an extraordinarily large and very highly developed group of people in India who have no religion and who are fortunately very influential in politics. You mentioned earlier, I don't know the case exactly, but you said there was a group called the Hindu Human Rights Association. You rather underlined its name as if it gave it some privilege, which wants to, which wants to prevent any untoward discussion or portrayal of Hindu God. I will bet you now, we can investigate later, I'll bet you those people are supporters of RSS Janasangh. I'll bet you they are. I'll bet you they're extreme Hindu fascists. I'll bet you they're the people who organized the murder of the Mahatma. And they call themselves the Hindu Human Rights Association, and they hope the Guardian will call them by their own name, as they call the Iraqi fascist insurgents. But I'm not having any of that. I have a perfect right to say I won't.
Can you enlarge on this concept? You use the term etiquette and civic responsibility, and I don't think there's any disagreement that this is a high achievement of restraint which embraces the freedom to criticize while having a regard to and respect for other cultures. This is very hard to achieve and is something very precious to be developed as a result of education and insight and so on. How do we spread that idea? We're having civic lessons in the schools in England now for children who are being taught these very values. Is that where the answer lies, do you think?
No, you're trying to be too warm and furry. You're hoping to wind up on a touching note of consensus and so on. It's not going to work. It's like people who say, why can't we unify rather than divide? Politics is division.
You use the word etiquette.
Politics and philosophy are division by definition. You may as well get used to it. The dialectic is the only way you learn anything. No, you can't build a bridge in the middle of the river. It's silly to try. I don't know why there should be an argument, or shouldn't be, in English schools. Did the Middle Passage, the slave trade, rescue a huge number of Africans from the hell of remaining in Africa?
You use the term etiquette.
Why not? There are many people who've argued at the time, have argued since. There are African Americans who say, I'm glad my ancestors didn't stay in Senegal. People think, oh God, how can you possibly say that after what the Middle Passage was like? Well, I have just in fact possibly said it. If you won't do that thought experiment, you're not thinking seriously about how the argument went on. There can be no taboos, and especially there can be no taboos enforced by one community on another. You can't mention this because it upsets us. No. Teaching of history is impossible. Teaching of philosophy is impossible. Teaching of argument, how to debate is impossible. How can you teach the Burke-Paine debate, or the debate between Wilberforce and Huxley about evolution, without upsetting somebody?
May I just say that you have, with your very example of the six-letter word in America, talked about something that is taboo. And unfortunately, whether you and I feel that way or not, there are a lot of Muslims for whom those caricatures of Muhammad were exactly what that six-letter word would be to a black American.
Nonsense.
I'm afraid
Islam claims to be a universal religion. It says it's for everybody. You can't say... I've heard absurd arguments made against me by people like George Galloway, coming back to that, saying they use the term anti-Islamic racism. You cannot be a racist by criticizing the Islamic religion. By definition, you cannot.
It's not a race.
No. There's now a stupid term that's trying to be imported into our culture, Islamophobia, as if to group it with...
anti-Semitism.
Or actually racism in general. Nonsense, I won't have it. I dislike Islam very much, as I do all religions. I have every right to say that I think it's absurd and an absurd and wicked belief. No one's going to tell me I can't say that. But if there's some crappy euphemism imported that says, we can't have you say that on the BBC, which I've actually had happen to me, then I think I'm being subjected to censorship, both officially and unofficially.
Someone got a microphone there?
Just a small point, if I may. Christopher, I think you just have to make a distinction between, on the cartoon issue, what Muslims feel offended by they are perfectly able to say, yes, the depiction of the Prophet in this way is wrong in Islam. The fact is that the distinction is that what they do as a consequence, or what they are seen to be doing as a consequence, threats of violence, actual violence in the way that you described earlier, also has no support in Islamic belief. So, on the one hand, yes, they are saying it's wrong to have the Prophet Muhammad depicted in this way. Equally, as a Muslim, it's important to recognize that those Muslims who have broken the law really have no basis in Islam to do that. The Prophet Muhammad, from the birth of Islam, faced great trials and tribulations, but in my reading of his life, the peaceful way of resolving dispute was always the way that was guaranteed to bring success. And that's how Islam, by and large, throughout most of the world.
Thank you. We're running out of time. We're well over time because we were enjoying ourselves, but I'm just going to ask, as we bring us to an end, the lights are flashing violently. You must address the George Galloway point that was made here.
Well, okay, but I don't want the gentleman there to think that I'm avoiding this. No. There is a fighting words exemption in some American jurisprudence about the First Amendment, and that's actually what Oliver Wendell Holmes was talking about. There's a time when a word is a weapon, when you're fighting a fight, and so forth. On the whole, that's been struck down. There hasn't been a speech prosecution in America since 1967-8, the middle of the Vietnam War. There were two prosecutions, one of my friend Julian Bond, who tried to run as a black man for an anti-war candidate for a seat in the Georgia Assembly, and because he was opposed to the war, even though he won the election, he was not allowed to be seated. And there was, in the same year, a prosecution of a Klansman for making Klan-like remarks. Both of those were struck down by the courts. There hasn't been a fighting words prosecution in the US since then, I believe I'm right in saying. And Mr. Galloway clearly did not call for the murder of the Prime Minister because he hasn't got enough guts to do that. He says, I would like it if it happened, but I'm not calling for it. In other words, if it does happen, don't look at me, but I did pre-approve it.
He said it would have a moral justification in his spectrum of moral.
He said it would be a good
Didn't
thing,
use
but
the
he
word
would,
like
but he
it.
did not. He recovered in time to say, well, of course I'm not recommending so. So if it happens, all we can say is that Galloway pre-approved it so that he's a coward, as I know him to be, a complete coward, moral coward, political coward, as well as a pimp for and a prostitute of Saddam Hussein and many other dictators. There's Aneurin Bevan used to say about the British press, there's no need for a censor because there's no need to muzzle sheep. Of George Galloway, you can say a person like that, who's a prostitute for fascism, convicts himself. But it was very interesting to see how unbrave he was, as well as how demagogic. An absolutely perfect combination of scumbaggery combined and double distilled. To your point, sir, I can't be expected to arbitrate on what is or is not the Muslim correct view. There are those who say that Islam mandates suicide bombing and the way to paradise, and there are those who say that's not true. Don't ask me to say which is the proper Islamic view. There appears to be no way to find out.
Christopher, I think I speak for us all in this room to say how much we enjoy these encounters, how important the debate of this nature is to the people here and to the world at large, in a world in which we feel the threat against ideas and expression, which we all stand by as one of the absolutely basic bedrock values of our society. So thank you for being here to debate that issue, and thank you to you all.